Blazing Dominion is right around the corner, and there's a lot you need to know about the upcoming format if you're a competitive player. In today's video, I'll be going over key interactions against the best new decks from the set, give you tips on how to build your deck for the new metagame, and cover common tech cards you need to play around so you're as prepared as possible. There's a lot to go over, so with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. So starting off with some key interactions you need to know against the best decks of the format. The biggest one that everyone should be prepared for is definitely going to be Cool Toon. Now I'm not going to be going over each of the Cool Toon cards, I'm sure you can do that on your own. Rather, I'll be talking about things you should know when playing in this matchup. So the first big thing is that all the Cool Toons have this effect where they can use like material from hand to synchro summon. This is a condition, it can't be negated by something like infinite impermanence, so even if you imperm your opponent's like normal summon, let's say, if they have another Cool Toon in hand, they're still going to be able to play the game. That's something that's pretty important to remember. It also makes it so low impact hand traps like imperm and Veiler do lose a little bit value against this deck, because as long as they've drawn another name, that's basically their extender, they can keep playing from there. Another big thing with this deck is that they have a lot of random rips from the extra deck, just banishing monsters from your extra deck randomly. And so this can be pretty devastating in certain matchups. Some decks do play a lot of very important one-offs, like something off the top of my head, maybe a deck like Branded, for example. Even a deck like Branded Dragotail, if they rip one of the Arthalions, it can be pretty detrimental for the grind game. So something to consider if you have that room in your extra deck, you maybe want to consider building your extra deck in a way that plays around these random rips. Maybe play extra copies of those key one-of boss monsters that you used to play. Now, I understand not every deck's going to be able to do this because extra deck space is generally pretty tight, but if your deck is one that is able to take advantage of this, I'd highly recommend just considering playing a few extra copies of those key extra deck monsters so you don't get blown up by just this random RNG effect one. Another big thing to remember against this deck is that their way to synchro summon on your turn is going to rely on one of their synchro monsters, but also more commonly their quick play spell. The quick play spell not only adds a Cool Toon card from the deck to the hand, it also lets them immediately synchro summon right afterwards. And something to keep in mind is like they get to synchro summon with the monster they just added because all the Cool Toons have the effect where they can use monsters in hand to synchro summon as well. There's a couple different ways to actually stop this card. Not only does it include an effect to add a card from deck to the hand, so you can stop with cards like Ash, stop it with Purge. It also has the effect to synchro summon, so you can stop it with a card like Impulse as well. That means there's some merit in when you're playing this matchup. Like if you, let's say, only have a single hand trap like Ash Blossom and you know your opponent's probably going to be able to play through it, saving it for your turn to stop a Cool Toon synchro isn't a terrible idea. And then finally, just to make sure your Cool Toon opponents aren't cheating against you, most of the time they're going to be locked into tuner synchro monsters, and that's pretty important because that really limits the pool of extra deck monsters that they can be going into. Of course, they're going to be going into like their Cool Toon engine monsters, but off the top of my head, the only other like relevant tuner synchro monster I think that they're going to be going into is Zaylin, the Chainbound Dragon. So just make sure that you're not being cheated by your opponent when they summon a normal synchro against you. The next deck I want to go over is Elfnote. So Elfnote wasn't a super popular deck in the last format, but I think with the new support, it is something that may start seeing meta play a little bit more often, so it's something you should start learning. The main gimmick with this deck, they have free extenders as long as they have their center main monster zone open. If you are able to, let's say, take up that zone with a Nibiru token, it can be really difficult for the deck to play around if they have no way to remove it. Even if a card like Nibiru may not seem super impactful at certain parts of their combo, if you just put the token in the middle main monster zone, it can actually be pretty hard for them to continue playing. Another thing you want to know against this deck is like out of all the Medius decks, I think that this deck probably relies on its the Power Patron monster the most, and so if you are able to cut off access to this Power Patron monster, the rest of the deck honestly just doesn't do nearly as much. Not only does the Power Patron bridge into their synchro side of the deck, it also gets them a Surge for an Elfnote card, which allows them to keep playing. So if you are able to cut off like a Surge card that would otherwise, let's say, Surge Power Patron or Summon Power Patron, well, you're going to be cutting off a very significant part of their deck. They're just left with like level 6 bodies that don't really do too much. And something important to know against the Elfnote engine is that they can eventually bridge into other engines. So like I mentioned, and with the main one being Fiendsmith. So the way that you're going to do that is like Medius, summon Elfnote Power Patron, synchro into Armades, Power Patron searches an Elfnote card to get their Elfnote engine online. Then they'll do all their Fiendsmith stuff with Armades, set up the DDD Wave Hiking Caesar to play around Nib, and then just play with their Elfnote cards after that. That's something that's pretty scary, but the important thing to remember here is Elfnotes, they don't necessarily lock you into anything significant. So there could be potentially other ways to play this deck as well. Just keep in mind when you're playing against like the Elfnote deck, you want to make sure you know what other supplementary engines your opponent is playing here so that you know better what to interrupt. If you all are finding this video helpful so far, all I ask is that you please consider subscribing to the channel. It doesn't mean anything to you, but it really makes a world of difference to me. It lets YouTube know that you enjoy watching this type of content, and it helps my channel grow, which I really appreciate. Only a very small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed, so if this video gave you anything useful so far, or if you're enjoying what you see, then all I ask is that you consider subscribing. Alright, let's get back to the video. The next deck I want to go over is DoomZ. One big thing to know about this deck is like a lot of their effects have additional effects to pop a card on the field after resolving. So for example, their new Pendulum monster lets them pop one of their own cards to search a card, but it also lets them randomly pop a card on the field afterwards. Similarly, one of their XD's monsters, when it searches a card, it gets to pop a card on the field afterwards. So when you're playing against this deck, you need to know that when you're letting these effects go through and they're going second into you, they're breaking your board while like building up their own hand and building up their own combo. So that Ash Blossom in your hand that you may have been saving for a big search, well, you might have to use it earlier against this deck because otherwise they're going to start blowing up your board. And not to mention, a lot of these cards also have effects when they are popped, so destruction-based removal against this deck is generally not going to be super good. Something else important to note against the DoomZ deck is that all of their starters get to a nib protection card early, whether that be Therion King Regulus or Utopic Future. They're always going to hold one extender in hand and then go into one of those nib protection cards before continuing with the rest of their combo. So if you have hand traps like Nibiru, you probably are going to have to nib them early unless you have a way to stop them from getting access to their nib protection card. This is also a deck that's fairly resilient to most hand traps, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in my how to deck build for this format, but just keep in mind against this deck, hand traps may not be the most effective. And finally, the last thing to know against DoomZ, their end board's gonna have multiple Omni Negates on it and a Floodgate trap that prevents you from adding cards from the deck to the hand. But the big thing to know about this deck is, aside from the trap card, they're usually not ending on anything else but monsters. That makes it so their board is particularly vulnerable to certain board breakers, or combinations of board breakers. Like for example, Dark Ruler is really good against this deck. A card like Illusion Gate plus Forbidden Droplet is pretty good against this deck. So while hand traps aren't necessarily the most effective, the best way to beat this deck could be just to try to break their board with those big breakers when you're going second. A few other Blazing Dominion decks I think you should know about. I didn't want to put each of these into their own size, but I wanted to go over them at a super high level so you have a general idea of what some of the other decks from this set can do. The first deck I think is important to know about is Red Dragon Archfiend. This is a big combo deck that focuses a lot on like recurring their tuners to start synchro climbing into their big boss monsters. End board's pretty layered, has a couple of trap cards that are really good, has a big beefy monster on the board that can act as interruptions. It kind of feels like that run-of-the-mill combo deck. Very good at putting up a big end board. Has a ton of extenders. This is a super scary combo deck if it's able to go first. Armage is sort of in a similar boat. It's a little bit more flexible than RDA, I'd say, because you aren't necessarily shoehorned into a certain way of playing with like synchro climbing. They are getting new support with the Power Patron stuff, which gives them additional extenders and a much higher ceiling. It did recently win the 3v3 YCS, so I think there is some merit to actually learning what this deck does. I'll be talking more about how to beat this deck in my Where to Hand Trap guide. That's going to be coming up in a week or two, so do stay tuned for that if you're interested. But at least for now, just know that this is, again, one of those big combo decks that is very scary if it gets to pop off. Now, a change of pace from those combo decks, Clown Clan is sort of a deck that plays a very mid-rangey / control style of gameplay. They focus around tributing their monsters to get additional disruption effects. For example, all their extra monsters have an effect where when they're tributed, they get to like return all monsters of the same type, like Synchro, XDs, or Fusion, from the fields and graveyard to the hand. So that's one way to interrupt your opponent. Whiteface is also one that allows you to gain some advantage or interrupt your opponent at the same time whenever it's tribute summoned. The main gameplay loop for this deck is going to be tributing their monsters, getting their tribute summon guys out, and interrupt your opponent that way, playing a slow, control-y grind style. One thing I will say with this deck, I don't think it's going to be super good right out of the gate, but it's a deck worth looking out for because this is a deck that's getting you support in the next set, and I think it'll be pretty good after that. Alright, so in this section, I wanted to quickly talk about how to approach deck building in the upcoming Blazing Dominion format, starting off with whether or not you should be playing hand traps or breakers. I would say, at least in the context of the new Blazing Dominion decks, the hand traps are going to be the best against those new combo meta stacks and combo heavy decks like Predaplant or Red Dragon Archfiend. These are decks I don't think you can really let combo because outside of DoomZ, a lot of their end boards are going to be very layered, and so breakers may not always be able to successfully break the full board. However, I will say that, as always in the debate between hand traps and breakers, hand traps are probably quote-unquote safer because in the matchups that would be an auto loss otherwise without hand traps, at least you have them. Whereas in the matchups where breakers can be better, well, at least hand traps can still do something to somewhat limit the end board of your opponent. And on the other hand, breakers I would say are much better into mid-range decks like Cool Tune and specifically a combo deck like DoomZ. This non-engine choice is going to be a lot more targeted than hand traps, and it probably won't be as good in certain matchups, but because Cool Tune is expected to be one of the best decks of the upcoming format and definitely the best deck out of Blazing Dominion, you really need to consider which matchups you want to respect when building your deck. Do you want to respect like the slightly more roguish combo matchups that are scarier when they get to go first, Or do you want to focus more on the likely best deck, which doesn't set up as crazy of a board, but you're likely going to see more often? And then finally, something else to consider, there's probably still going to be old meta decks that are running around, at least for the first few weeks of this format until we get a ban list. So decks like Yummy, Draco Tail, Vanquish Soul, these are decks that are still going to be very good in BLZD Dominion. This is not a set like Justice Hunters where all of a sudden, well, these are the only new decks that people are going to be playing, and all the old decks are just power crept by these new cards. That's not the case with BLZD Dominion. Until we get a ban list, old decks, like I mentioned, are still going to be very good, and so you still want to consider whether or not your deck is built to handle those as well. Finally, I want to talk about some common format staples that you should be playing around in this upcoming format. The first big one is going to be Fidralis Harmonia. This is a hand trap that procs whenever you activate a monster effect on the field. They're going to be able to summon it from hand, dump a synchro from their extra deck to the graveyard, and then non-targeting pop one of the monsters you control. And generally, that's going to be multiple interruptions because the synchro monsters they sent to the graveyard can have a very proactive interruption effect like Malong to bounce one of your cards back to the hand. Or if they don't need the extra interruption right away, they can dump a card like Rune Pegasus at Ignister to the graveyard to get additional value later on in the game. Either way, Fidralis Harmonia is pretty much always going to be trading up into you. They're getting a free body, they're popping one of your monsters, and then they're getting a synchro monster with some sort of disruption effect against you. Every deck that has either extra deck space or is playing synchros like Cool Tune are definitely going to be playing 3 copies of this card. So whenever you play against those decks, you definitely are going to be going up against this card. A hand trap that is a little bit more specific but still very good is going to be Dominus Spark. Dominus Spark has that same condition as like the Canaan monsters. When your opponent has activated a monster effect in the hand or grave, you can play it from hand, and it lets them banish one monster the opponent controls. So something to watch out for with this card is not only can they use it as a proactive hand trap, so let's say you use the hand effect and they want to interrupt you on your turn to like remove one of your bodies, they can do that, but they risk giving you an extender by letting you summon a card from hand. Whereas with this card, they don't actually have to play it during your combo. If you're able to set up your end board, they can just simply say, okay, end phase, activate this, banish one of your key interruptions, and then that's traded 1-for-1 with one of the best cards on your end field. So just be aware that they don't necessarily have to use Dominus Spark in the context of a regular hand trap. They can sort of use it as a pseudo breaker. Now, very few decks are going to be able to play this. Pretty much only light or dark decks are going to be able to take advantage of this. One other card to play around is the new quote-unquote super polymerization. Apex polymerization is a pseudo super polymerization card. A lot of fusion decks can either use it as an extender, so like target one of their own monsters they control, summon one guy from the extra deck, and then immediately fuse into another guy, so they can use that as an extender in that case. Or they can use it as that pseudo super polymerization where they target one of your guys, summon a guy from their extra deck, and then fuse both of those away. So in most cases, it's just going to be an extra extender in certain fusion decks like Lunalight with the potential option of acting as a super poly when they're going second. So definitely a very scary card, but again, not many decks are going to be playing this. Only fusion based decks are going to be able to take full advantage of this. But on the other hand, the last staple I'm going to be talking about, Solemn Report, is a card that can be used by any deck. The first effect isn't super relevant where you can activate the turn it's set. That effect's probably never going to come up because it does require you to have another trap. But why this card is so good is because not only does it act as essentially extra copies of Solemn Judgment, because you are able to stop those big board breakers like Harpy's Feather Duster, you also are able to side this in against specific matchups that really rely on a single spell trap card. So think a deck like Sky Striker with Sky Striker Engage, or a deck like Radiant Typhoon with Mystical Space Typhoon. If you are playing any of those decks that center around those single spell and trap cards, this is going to be a very scary card to go against in this upcoming format, and it's probably going to force you to play a little bit more differently, or force you to play tech cards to try to remove your opponent's back row before full committing your own engine into it. But if you aren't playing any of those decks, Solemn Report is basically like 3 extra copies of Solemn Judgment. Yeah, it doesn't stop like summons, but generally Solemn Judgment is always being used to stop those blow small trap cards anyways. So that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you guys thought about in the comment section below. Let me know if you think I missed anything important to talk about in this upcoming format, and let me know if you have any other questions about the format in the comment section below. Before I end off of the video, I also want to give a quick shout out to CardTrader. You can check them out using my affiliate link in the description below and use code TCGSam for 5% off your entire order while helping to support the channel. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.